Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're digging into the core ideas from Mary Frances Berry's really important book, Black Resistance/White Law. It gets at this huge question. After the Civil War, the U.S. Constitution was literally rewritten to promise freedom and equal protection. So how is it that for the next 100 years, that promise was so violently and consistently broken? Well, the book argues that the answer isn't a flaw in the law, but something baked into its very design. I mean, on paper, the change was absolutely revolutionary. You have these three powerful amendments added to the Constitution, one after another. The 13th ends slavery, period. The 14th says you are a citizen and you have equal protection under the law. And the 15th secures the right to vote. This was supposed to be the bedrock of a whole new America. And just to make sure everyone got the message, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And you can see the language here is crystal clear. It wasn't just about what you couldn't do anymore. It was about what you had to do. Guarantee safety and equality. The promise couldn't have been more explicit. But here's the thing. That's not what happened. Not even close. What followed were decades of lynchings, mob violence, and just systematic terror against Black communities. The law said one thing, but the reality on the ground was something else entirely. So what gives? Why did a system with all these promises on the books fail so completely to protect its own citizens? And this is where the book's central insight really clicks into place. This wasn't a series of accidents. It wasn't a bug. It was a feature. And to really get it, we're going to use a single, really powerful metaphor. Okay, first thing you have to wrap your head around is this. A right, written down on a piece of paper, it doesn't do anything on its own. For it to mean anything at all in the real world, someone has to actively enforce it. And that leads us right to the next piece of the puzzle. The decision to enforce a right, to actually step in and protect someone, well, that's not automatic. It all comes down to the choices, the incentives, the political will of the people who are in power. So this brings us to the book's fire alarm metaphor. Think of the Constitution's protections like a fire alarm. When racial violence breaks out, the alarm should start ringing. It signals danger. But here's the critical part. It's wired to an optional switch. The authorities, the federal government, can hear the alarm, see the smoke, and then choose whether or not to flip the switch and send help. Protection isn't a guarantee, it's discretionary. It's a choice. So you can probably guess what happened. For decades, when that fire alarm was blaring because of violence against Black Americans, what did those in power do? Over and over, they chose to not flip the switch. They just let it ring. And get this, the system actually created its own legal justifications for doing nothing. A perfect example is this 1906 Supreme Court case, Hodges v. United States. The court essentially ruled that protecting people from this kind of racial violence was a state problem, not a federal one. And just like that, they gave the federal government a constitutional excuse to look the other way for almost 50 years. And in practice, this turned into basically a form letter response. When civil rights groups would beg for federal help, the Justice Department would just send back a version of this, saying it wasn't their jurisdiction. They'd punt the responsibility back to local officials, who were often the very people participating in the violence. And if you want to see the real-world result of that in action, just look at this number. In its first couple of years, the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division took on 52 prosecutions for police brutality. You know how many of those ended in acquittals? 46. That is an almost complete breakdown of accountability. The alarm was ringing off the hook, but the system was designed to ignore it. But, and this is the critical twist, it's not that the federal government couldn't act. It absolutely could. And it did, when it felt like it. The power was always there. So the real question becomes, when and why did it finally choose to flip the switch? And this comparison just makes the whole argument impossible to ignore. When the fire was white violence against Black citizens, the response was inaction, and the justification was states' rights. But when the fire was Black resistance, protests, activism, suddenly it was a threat to national order. The response was immediate, direct intervention, using everything from FBI surveillance to federal troops. You know, this pattern is consistent throughout history. Federal power was used to crush slave revolts, to spy on and break up civil rights groups, and to hand down swift indictments after Black-led protests. The contrast is just so stark. When the political will was there, the federal government had all the power it needed and moved incredibly fast. So when you put all these pieces together, what are you left with? Well, the book argues that we have to stop thinking about this history as a series of tragic accidents or a system that's just broken. The ultimate conclusion here is that this isn't a bug, it's a feature. This selective, inconsistent protection is the predictable, recurring output of a system where safeguarding people's lives is a choice, not an automatic function. And understanding that design helps us understand why these patterns have been so persistent for so long. Which, of course, leaves us with the essential question for then and for now. If protection is a choice, what actually forces those in power to finally flip that switch? What does it really take? This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.